Hello and welcome to this edition of Consciousness Raising Online. Hello, Clyde. Good to see you. Thank you. Uh, Sorry the music took so long to kick in, or for me to kick in, because I was getting a contradictory uh, information that said it wasn't on. Okay. Now, today, what I'm going to do is present actually a very comprehensive uh, session because what I want to share with you is some information about African countries' debt and why that's important for us to understand and how it's going to change. Because Africa, being a very, very wealthy continent, has millions of people who live in poverty. And when I get through sharing this information with you, you probably should have a better understanding of why that is and why it's obscene. One of the things about Fidel Castro and also Che Guevara was that they pushed very heavily, especially in South America, the idea that they should not have to pay the debts to their former colonizers. And they also shared that with African countries. They said there's no way a formerly colonized country should have to pay the former colonizer. And I'm very much about that. And so when I share with you this information over the next few minutes, you're going to say, what? And also understand why, under the present circumstances, most of these countries, if not all of the countries that I'm going to name, will never be able to get out from under debt and will never be able to uh, use their own resources for their own people unless some serious changes come about. And at the end of the presentation, I'm going to share with you some information that hopefully will give you a different perspective on so-called helpers, people who call themselves trying to help African countries, because it's real deep. Okay. All right. So first, I'm going to set out some information on the top 10 African countries that owe the most debt. Okay. And it's a combination of debt owed to the World Bank as well as their former colonizers, as well as outside African entities. Okay. And I think you're going to find it quite surprising. The first one is called Capo Verde or Cape Verde, and this is an island cluster. It's a cluster of volcanic islands along the central Atlantic. Now, see this map? Cabo Verde, okay, North Atlantic Ocean. And look at this, beautiful place, beautiful place. Um, Now, Cabo Verde supposedly has no natural resources because it's basically volcanic islands, but it uses salt, limestone, and pozzolana, which is a volcanic rock, as its main source of money generators. Okay, but now the International Monetary Fund says that Cabo Verde, that set of little islands, has $2.5 billion worth of debt. Now, I want you to understand why this is important to understand. Um, how do you get that much debt? $2.5 billion worth of debt. Population very small. It's a set of islands. Okay. So we'll come back to that, but just understand this is $2.5 billion worth of debt. All right. The next country is called Eritrea or Eritrea, either one. and it's been in a years long battle with Ethiopia because it was once part of Ethiopia and then they declared themselves independent and they had to fight about it and they fought about it. Just recently, they have come to terms and ended the war. But Eritrea, its economics has taken a big toll because of the war. It's mostly agricultural, but they've had famine as well as war. Now, of course, the International Monetary Fund says that Eritrea is $8.67 billion in debt. Again, keep in mind, we're talking about billions of dollars. And for those who don't know, let me walk you through $1 billion. First of all, $1 million is 1,000 thousands. Okay? So if you had 1,000 thousands, you would have $1 million. Sort of like if you could find a way to make $1,000 per day for 1,000 days straight and keep it all, then you have $1 million. Now to have $1 billion, you will uh, you will need 1,000 millions. That would be $1 billion. Okay, 1,000 millions is $1 billion. So when we're looking at Eritrea owing $8.67 billion in debts, we're talking about 8,000 millions. 8,000 millions. That's insane. All right, let me move to the next one. Uh, the Republic of the Congo. Now, the Republic of Congo is also called Congo Brazzaville. It's right in Central Africa. And the Republic of Congo is the fourth largest producer of oil in the Gulf of Guinea. So it'll be a map coming up in a minute so you can see exactly where a Republic of Congo is. All right, you see Congo, the Republic of Congo is right next to Congo Zaire in Angola, Equatorial Guinea. Little tiny country. They also have forestry, which is trees and minerals, as sources of capital. Yet the International Monetary Fund says the country is in debt $11.5 billion. Okay? $11.5 billion. Now, let me share something else with you because I mentioned that they have forestry, trees. There are a lot of things that are illegally exported out of Africa that basically is stolen. One of them is forestry, trees. And trees out of Cameroon, the Republic of Congo, Equatorial Guinea, which is right there, Gabon, Ghana, and also the Democratic Republic of Congo. Trees are stolen from those countries to the extent of $13 billion a year. Listen carefully. $13 billion worth of trees are stolen out of Africa. And the International Monetary Fund says that the Republic of Congo by itself owes $11.5 billion. Something is wrong with this picture. They also, there's a mineral called cassiterite that's stolen out of the Congo as well. So they and oil also. Oil is stolen out of Africa, and oil is stolen out of the Republic of Congo. So if these elements were not stolen, in fact, it's stolen by and sold to countries that these countries owe money to. Isn't that strange? Okay. All right. Next one. Little country called Togo. Togo is a West African country. There it is, right there. It's a tiny country between Ghana and Benin. Now, Togo is one of the countries that a lot of the kidnapped Africans were taken out through Togo. Its major sectors of economic growth are agriculture, breweries, and textiles. But they supposedly also owe about $4 billion. So again, we have a situation where, look at that. That's beautiful, beautiful agriculture there. Um, if they weren't being stolen, their elements, uh, they would be able to do quite well. That's why I said that it's going to change, and I'll get to that in a minute. But here's another country. It's called the Gambia. And when I went to Senegal, the Gambia is right next to Senegal. In fact, they usually are put together for some reason, but it's a lot of desert, but it also has a lot of people, and it has a lot of cities. Look at the city right there. Um, Now the Gambia relies heavily on ground nuts production and export, ground nuts, farming, and also tourism. But its population is estimated as about 48.5% living in poverty. So half of the population supposedly lives in poverty. And they're supposed to be, now their debt is very small considering theirs is only $1.2 billion. But when the country doesn't have a lot to work with, you see how it runs through the different areas, uh, right in the middle of Senegal, really. So that $1 billion worth of debt hurts them because they can't use that for themselves. But now the country does pretty well, but half the country lives in what they call poverty. If they didn't have that debt, I bet that half the population would do a lot better too. Okay, that's the Gambia. Now here's a country that really I was pissed. This is Mozambique. Now Mozambique is considered one of the poorest and underdeveloped countries in the world. But here's why. Mozambique fought for years to get out from under colonization. They were colonized by, all right, I want you to see where it is on the map. See where it is over here on the coast, next to Zimbabwe and South Africa. And they fought for years to get out from under colonization. And it was definitely going socialist. And they were rejecting the West. And they had planned on definitely taking the land that the whites had taken, had stolen, and they were going to give it back to the people. And they found themselves frozen out of many different things. You see where they are. The West and South Africa, they banded together to hurt the hell out of Mozambique. They did what I call they did a Haiti on them. They did everything they could to strangle their economy, to stop them at every point they were trying to move forward, and their economy collapsed. Now they are supposedly, dig this, they have a strong agriculture, aluminum, and petroleum production, oil production, okay? Chemical production, food and beverage sectors are very fruitful. However, the country is $16 billion in debt. What happens is the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, they work hand in hand. And basically what they say is this: if you owe us money, you you can you have to buy certain things from certain countries, and they can dictate to you what you can grow. So, for an example, your country might be very strong about growing its own food, okay? Corn and wheat and all kinds of vegetables, right? But now you get into debt, and the International Monetary Fund will say, well, for you to get credit in the at the World Bank, then you have to you have to stop growing corn and wheat and instead grow grapes. And you'll have to import corn and wheat. Now, you would say, well, why would they do that? Well, it's called advantage. See, when this country starts having to import corn and wheat, they have to import it from another country, which now gets money out of that economy. And the grapes that they are forced to grow will be sold to winemaking countries, okay? And they get them dirt cheap. So they do all this kind of machinations and stuff, and they can break a country. So Mozambique being $16 billion in debt hurts them badly. And you see how big those cities are, right? It's not a tiny, tiny nothing. Mozambique is pretty big. Okay, let me move on. Look at that. I love this. Wait, let me go back here for a minute because one of the things about Mozambique, see this water? Look at that water. That water is so pure and clean. You can see to the bottom. That's the ocean. That's the ocean right there. You can see the ocean. It's right there on the ocean between Malawi over there on the right. And so um, that alone like drives me crazy. That they have such richness, and they're forced to do things that leave their people in poverty. I hope that picture comes back up one more time before I go, because it's just now. This is I believe it's Maputo is the name of their major city. Um, but if you've ever been to some of the islands like Jamaica and Bahamas and stuff, you'll see this kind of clear water. That's just gorgeous. Look at that. Okay, let me move on. Next is Tunisia. And I have a friend, his name is Tunis. And Tunis was actually named after Tunis in Tunisia, because that's the capital, is Tunis. And his mother once told him that he was conceived while the song Nights in Tunisia was playing. And if you've never heard Nights in Tunisia, you should check it out. It's a great song. But yeah, that's how my good friend Tunis says his mother told him he was conceived in that song. Okay. Now Tunisia, um, Tunisia is a country in North Africa. In North Africa, and in fact, a lot of the people appear to be light skinned. It's very Muslim oriented, and it's one of the areas where they actually did in a lot of changing up of the population. um, but now listen to this: Tunisia, it has energy production, which is oil, mining, agriculture, tourism, and oil and petroleum products. Okay, now it's a very rich country, but it owes $30 billion. $30 billion. Therefore, there's a large part of the population that is poor. You see, it's right there between Algeria and Libya. That's incredible that they owe $30 billion. And at the rate that it's going, if they don't make some serious changes, they'll never get out of that debt because they can barely pay the interest on this debt. See, y'all, you have to understand that when you have this kind of debt, the interest payments, if you've ever bought a house, you know how this works. You pay for years. The, the primary or the majority of your mortgage payment, if you got a 30-year mortgage, for the first 20 years, the majority of your mortgage payment is going towards interest, is it not? You don't really begin to dig into the principal until the last 10 years of the mortgage. Well, if you're a country and you got $30 billion in debt, you just doing good to make the interest payments every quarter. And you're a long way from making a dent on the principal. That's crazy. $30 billion. Okay? It's another beautiful, beautiful country right there on the coast. All right. Now this one tripped me out. This is Sao Tome Principe. Sao Tome and Principe. It's a set of little islands, and I'll show them to you. You'll see them on the map in a minute. Sao Tome and Principe. Um, it's in the Gulf of Guinea. And supposedly the islands were uninhabited. This is what the Europeans say. They say the islands were uninhabited until the 15th century. I don't believe that because when you see where they are on the map, they're right next to Africa, to the continent. Got these beautiful beaches and all of that. You know the African folks was going over there hanging out, and I can't believe that it was uninhabited to the 15th century. Now, their economy is sustained through cocoa production and agriculture. You see, now look at this real quick. You see how tiny those islands are? Sao Tome and Principe, right? I bet you can't guess how much debt they owe. How about $34 billion? $34 billion. That's absurd. What'd you say? Clyde say that amount of debt is reductio ad absurdum. I assume that means it means absurd, right? I know that part. I don't know what reducto means, reductio, but it's crazy. That little little group of those little islands owing $34 billion in debt? Why? For what? How did they accumulate that kind of debt? You see, those are the questions that will be asked and answered over the next decade because they will never get out from under that debt under the present circumstances. But the question is, how did they get that kind of debt? Okay? All right. The next one, Sudan. Sudan. Now, Sudan, of course, those that know the history of Sudan and know about Sudan know that there are more pyramids in Sudan than in Egypt. Okay? Sudan has had a lot of issues, but now listen to this one. This is really gonna blow your mind. Let's see. Let me see if a map comes up real quick so you can get it in your head exactly where Sudan is. Okay, you see Sudan? All right. Sudan basically is a oil producing country. Okay, it's a huge moneymaker for the Sudan. But here's the problem. Sudan's debt is $73 billion. You heard me. $73 billion. You say, wait a minute, how, if it's a huge oil producing country, how can it have $73 billion of debt? Well, one of the reasons why is that there's a huge amount of illegal trading of oil going on in Africa. Close to $100 billion a year in illegal oil trading goes on with African oil. They have illegal refineries. They have nationalization of pipelines and exploitation. The West, meaning the United States and European countries, do a whole lot of finagling with oil. Y'all know this. They steal over $100 billion in oil every year. And that's how you end up with countries like Sudan owing $73 billion. And it doesn't just hurt Sudan, it also hurts Nigeria, which is a huge oil uh, oil producing country, which is outrageous because you know the poverty in Nigeria is so high. And Nigeria is the largest population in Africa. Um, but they have done so much work in Nigeria of keeping it under its thumb. For an example, most of the immigrants from Africa come from Nigeria. And you'd be amazed at how many little pockets of Nigerian students are in the United States. And they are almost always kept totally separate from black populations. I know for a fact that at the University of Kansas, and this goes back a few years, uh, there was a whole little community of Nigerian students who were going to the University of Kansas, and they lived either with white families or they lived in apartments or dorms, and they were told, don't go to Kansas City, Missouri, don't go to St. Louis, because you might be mistaken for American blacks, and American blacks will rob you, all kinds of stuff. Now it just happens that through some things that occurred, um, the person who was the head of the African Studies Department was a Nigerian, and actually by accident he ended up going out to Leavenworth Penitentiary, and he ended up for a while being a liaison with the African Culture Society, which was an organization at Leavenworth Penitentiary, and that's how they found out about the Nigerian students and what they were taught. Now, how they got here, and this is another part of it, virtually all the Nigerians who get to come to the United States come after they have been thoroughly indoctrinated in Catholic schools. And so they come here with a different mindset, with the mindset anti American blacks and all of that stuff. Um, and that's why a lot of times we have black folks in this country who have a negative attitude about all Africans because they may have only had contact with some Nigerians who are here as students or what have you, and they've already been indoctrinated. Okay? But you see how Sudan is $73 billion in debt. That's a shame and a disgrace, but that's got to change. Here's the last one. Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe. Well, we know about Zimbabwe, or certain things about Zimbabwe that's been in the news in the last couple of years. Um, but we should understand certain things about Zimbabwe because they fought for their liberation during the same time Mozambique was fighting for theirs. And Zimbabwe is a landlocked country, meaning it does not have access to the ocean. Okay? And it means that the rivers that come there are very important. Now, one of the cool things about Zimbabwe, as you're looking right now, that is Victoria Falls. Actually, they're working on changing the name of that. It's named after Queen Victoria. But it is one of the, if not the largest, it's one of the top two or three waterfalls in the world. It is huge and it's beautiful. And they could use it for power generation if they could get the money to build it. They mostly generate funds from minerals and gold, agriculture, and mining. But even so, the country owes $14.5 billion. And they had shut down, the World Bank had shut them down for money for years, which is why it went from being a fairly rich country to a very poor country because the bankers cut it off. And that's what tends to happen. Um, there's a couple other areas of agriculture, etc., that's being stolen in Africa. For example, fisheries. Fisheries is a big theft. Tuna, lobster, shrimp, mackerel. Uh, Large amounts come from African countries, but over $2.5 billion worth of fish or seafood is stolen out of African countries every year. $2.5 billion. And if we look at it a different way, what if those countries got to keep that $2.5 billion? Right? It would help them with they're poor, they're hungry, right? Also, poaching, elephant tusks, rhinoceros horns, uh, something like something between $7 billion and $20 billion worth of animal parts are sold worldwide, and most of that poaching occurs in South Africa, Tanzania, and countries around there. That's a big steal, a big, big, big steal. Now, those are the top 10 biggest owers, African countries that owe. And I didn't have time to count it all up, but I'll tell you this much. It's obscene how much, obscene how much, okay, how much debt there is, right? Hundreds of billions of dollars is supposedly owed to outside of African entities. But now, this might seem like a little shift, but it's not really. Because what I'm going to talk about right now, I need you to focus with me to understand something. Now, because our perception about Africa is that it's full of crooked leaders and who are stealing all the money and poverty and disease. And yes, there are a few who have stolen some money, but they ain't nothing compared to the Western nations that have been stealing the resources for years. And here's the cold part: the African countries that have leaders that steal the money, you know where they put that money? They put it in European and American banks. Yeah. And there's been cases where those European or American banks cut them off and keep the money, hold the money for years. But there's a whole new level of colonization going on in Africa. It's actually a recolonizing. Now, what I want you to understand is this. This time it's not with armies or these phony borders they put up between, creating differences between countries, but Western governments and humanitarian organizations have been imposing certain things on African countries. These things include population control ideology, sexual liberation, and abortion. I'll say it again: population control ideology, sexual liberation, and abortion. Now, see, for a long time, there's been this Western attitude or idea that the world is overpopulated, and what should be done is population control. Well, you have these government and non governmental agencies that have gone into African countries with what they call birth control. Birth control is nothing more than population control. And wealthy people from Western nations, organizations, and private foundations have been the helpers and deliverers of birth control, population control, with these gifts to African countries. Now, some of them might, have good intentions, but some of them don't. But either way, they have a serious effect on these countries. And I'll show you how. Virtually all the time, when they give money to these countries, they attach ideologies to them. For an example, they'll say, well, um, if you want this money to buy farm equipment, you all have to demonstrate that you're not discriminating against gays and lesbians. The country says, wait a minute, what's that got to do with farm equipment? And they say it has nothing to do with it. It's part of our philosophy. We cannot give money to countries where there's discrimination against gays and lesbians. Uh, it gets deeper than that because under the guise of sexual liberation, they push very aggressively their views on contraception, population control, sexualization of children, feminism, homosexuality, and abortion. And I know you're saying, well, we had that here. What's the problem? Well, part of the problem is that it forces countries to have to adhere to Western standards in order to get money or resources to feed their children, their people. Doesn't matter what their philosophies are, doesn't matter what their ideologies are. In order to get this money, in order to get these resources, you got to adhere to the philosophies and ideologies of these organizations. And even deeper, some of these organizations deal with exploiting the heaviest burdens and afflictions of African countries, like maternal mortality, mothers dying giving birth, unplanned pregnancies, HIV/AIDS pandemic, child marriage, and persistent poverty. Now, I'm going to show you how deep this goes. Foreign aid gifts with strings attached. Here's how deep it goes. In 1994, at a conference in Cairo, Egypt, Western governments were told that if they gave money to African countries, it could qualify as aid even if it was contraceptives. And so between 1994 to 2012, this kind of aid, being contraceptives, went from $600 million a year through the whole continent to over $12 billion a year for contraceptives. Okay? Now, sometimes they gave it with strings attached, and sometimes they gave it as loans. You give a country $1 billion worth of contraceptives as a loan and say, well, you only got to pay back half. It's still a $500 million in debt, and they may not even need it. They may not need them contraceptives, but they went further, and this is where it gets very sick. There's a little bitty organization in the United Kingdom, in Great Britain. It's called Population Matters. Population Matters did this. It said that they could buy environmental credit for the electricity and the energy they consume. See, they start talking about these footprints, right? All right. Now, every country is supposed to be working on getting their footprint to be smaller. But they allowed for countries, if they went over their amount of electricity that they use or energy that they use, they could buy credits from doing different things. For an example, if they gave if they planted X number of trees in another country, that might get them some credits on their footprint. Okay? What they did in Africa, with Africa, this is what they did. They told the Western countries, if you um, if you uh, gave money based on their CO2 emissions for contraceptives and abortions, you could offset your carbon emissions for contraceptives and sterilizations. Sterilizations. So it wasn't enough that they just said, well, you give some money for contraceptives. They gave money for for sterilizations, and that included abortions. And so for every African child that wasn't born, they got a credit. And so y'all just don't understand. The United Kingdom, uh, it had a higher carbon emissions per capita, 135 times that of in Ethiopia, but they got credits that allowed them to keep their carbon emission standards that high by giving money for African children not to be born. Yeah. So if they gave money for the car rides and the plane rides that they took, or cup of coffees that they buy, their use of electricity, they make it up by donating money to this group who will go to Africa and do vasectomies on African men and do sterilizations on African women. I don't know how much you understand about that, but I'm just telling you that's some devilish stuff. Devilish. Now, there was a woman who basically did the research to uncover this pattern. And I'm going to show you a short video, but it's not dealing with that specifically. But here's what the deal is. In 2016, she was at the United Nations during a session on the best practices for maternal health in Africa. It was at the Commission on the Status of Women. And what happened was, in her remarks, she talked about what I just talked about. And she said that this amounts to promoting of abortion was colonization. And she, broke it down quite clearly, because it is. When you force people to have to, in order to get aid, that you force the government to uh, force sterilization and abortions on the women in their country, uh, that's colonization. Well, there was a Danish woman who represents some kind of organization that does work in Africa, and she took umbrage, or she was offended by the sisters saying that that was colonization. And she argued that the Africans should regard this as a positive development and let Africans make their own choices. You know, how they say that is women's choices, right? And the sister came back and broke it down to her. What I'm going to do is show you the short video. It will include, first, the Danish woman. Now, I want you to listen carefully to what she said, because on the surface, it sounds righteous, that they're simply helping these African women to be able to make their own choices, and that's liberating, okay? But when you hear the sister, her name is Ekichoa, when you hear how she breaks it down, I think you will agree that yeah, it's colonization, okay?
Now we only have around 10 minutes for your questions. I would like to call on the first three questions that we could have. I guess I would start over here at the back. I think she was the first one.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Oh, now it works. My name is Mette Gjerskov. I am from the Danish Parliament. I'm a former minister. And first allow me to express my respect for all the work you do for women all over the world and, of course, Africa. I was a bit provoked by the thought of new colonialism. Being from Europe, of course, this hurts me. And so I would like to share a bit, because I have been to Africa, and I know that there are different countries, and I've been to Zimbabwe and Mali and Tunisia and Tanzania and Kenya and Rwanda, and a lot of African countries. And I've spoken to a lot of African women. And my lesson learned from being from a colonialistic society is do no harm. Allow people to make their own choices. And when I've been to Africa, I've spoken to a lot of women, and some women want this, and some women want that. But I think we should allow them to decide for themselves. And that includes freely decide over their own body, their own sexuality, when and how many babies they want, if they want contraception, if they want abortion. We don't have to put it on anybody else. So if you want to make sure that you don't start a new colonization, let people make their own choices, decide over their own body. Thank you very much.
Sorry, I'd like to address the lady who had spoken, the Danish lady who had spoken about comparing African women not having the right to choose what to do with her body and it being colonization. It's actually quite amazing how you were able to kind of twist that into shape, to that thought. But I must say this to you. I am from a tribe called the Igbo tribe in Nigeria. If I tried to translate in my native tongue what it means for a woman to choose what to do with her body, I couldn't. Most of the African native languages don't even have a way of phrasing abortion to mean anything good. Now, as communities of people and as societies, where it actually then becomes colonization, a neo-colonization, is that people from the Western world come to Africa and try to give us these kinds of language that we could never translate into our native tongue. They tell us that it actually can mean something for a woman to do something with her body, which isn't really morally bad. But anyway, the first thing that we have to think of and remember is that as communities, which was one thing I highlighted right at the beginning, culturally, most of the African communities actually believe, by tradition, by their cultural standards, that abortion is a direct attack on human life. So for anybody to convince a woman that abortion is good, sorry. So I'm sorry. So for anybody to be able to convince any woman in Africa that abortion is actually a good thing and can be a good thing, you first of all have to tell her that what her parents and her grandparents and her ancestors taught her what is actually wrong. You're going to have to tell her that they have always been wrong in their thinking, and that, madam, is colonization.
We are, excuse me.
Woo, boy. I don't know if you caught that. You might have to go back and when this comes back on the recording, listen to it again because what the sister said was deep. Two things she said, and I close with this because we hear this all the time about a woman's right to choose what to do with her body. That's one of the feminist points. And when it comes to uh, the quote right to life uh, and abortions, etc. Right? Well, one of the things she said is that in at least in the Igbo language, uh, there is no there's no language equivalent. You cannot express in the Igbo language abortion as a good thing. When you stop and think about it, she said no. In our culture and in most African cultures, abortion is seen as a direct attack on human life. And when you stop and think about it, that makes sense. Okay? But even deeper, she said to convince any woman in Africa that abortion is actually a good thing and can be a good thing, you first of all have to tell her that what her parents and what her grandparents and her ancestors have taught her was you have to teach them that all of that was wrong. That what her parents taught her was wrong, what her grandparents taught her was wrong, what her ancestors taught her was wrong. Woo! You're going to have to tell her that they have always been wrong in their thinking, and that is colonization. Wow. As I close, hey, Rimby, good to see you. um, as I close, I want to say this. Africa, what's going on in Africa will change. And I say it will change because more and more is being understood about this whole debt thing. That with all the wealth that the African continent has, more and more of the people in Africa are seeing that the boundaries of their countries were artificially placed. They're seeing and learning the history of the colonization and what it cost them. They're coming to understand even more that uh, their poverty is not something that they created. That African people are not just destined to be poor, and so they will begin to reject the debt. I'm saying it right in here in 2018. You hear me say it. A phrase that I'm almost guaranteeing you will hear in the future. Reject the debt. These debts that these countries owe, billions of dollars, they're artificially placed. They're wrong. And these countries will stop paying them because, number one, they can't afford them. And number two, they're wrong. They're illegitimate. And so the phrase will be reject the debt. And I'm saying this because, in a way, I honestly feel that the debt that we black people owe in the United States, I feel it's illegitimate. See, one of the reasons we are or the poverty level is so high among black people in the United States is because we did not get reparations. And Clyde is one of the best people I know that's on this case. See, when we came out of slavery, we got nothing. We started with nothing. And so, in order to eat, we had to find a way to get some food in order to put shelter over our families. And many of us had to go look for our families, right? To get clothes on our backs. We had to go into debt because we had nothing to start with. So we were immediately, many of us went into sharecropping, okay? That was a ripoff. Some of us found ourselves in the convict leasing programs. And if you don't know what that is, you should look it up because that's how a big part of the South was rebuilt after the Civil War. And through just all kinds of things, underpaying us on the jobs we did get. And so we immediately went from being enslaved to debtors. And that debt grew with every generation. One of the biggest crimes they did to us was convincing my generation that education was the key to liberation. And they turned around and made college debt so big that it looms like a national debt on us in particular. Yeah, think about it like that. They already say that the college debt in this country is, huge. It's like $1 trillion plus. I guarantee you, if you check with the majority of black folks who went to college in the last 20 years, the majority of them have college debt. I was one. They begged me to take a little BS loan when I went to school in 1960. When I went to college in 1968, 69, they begged me to take a loan. Said, "Hey, don't even worry about paying it back. It was only a couple of $1,000s, and I didn't need it, but they worried me to death." So I finally went down there. They took my free money, and then I didn't pay it back. Years later, that debt came back, and with interest and penalties, and that little I think it was $1,900, had ballooned to something like $4,500, which in perspective is not much compared to a lot of other folks' student debt. But I had to pay that back. And trust me, when I paid it back, I made sure I got every kind of receipt there is to show that I paid that debt. Because college debt, they won't let you put it in a bankruptcy. And in fact, if you die, they'll sue your estate to get that money. So it's deep. But that's our debt. Like the African countries have debt, we got debt. And we cannot get ahead. And then they turned around and took my parents' generation's houses, put them in brand new debt through refinancing scams. Yeah, that was one of the biggest ripoffs. So reject the debt. That's my saying. And I'm gone now. As always, I say no justice, no peace, no love. KNOW.